Hi everyone, Alice Zhao here from Maven Analytics. We have a new course out called Data and AI Ethics, and in this video, I'll be chatting with instructor Chris Bruehl on AI ethics basics, as well as how this impacts us as data professionals. Hi Chris, congrats on the new course.
Thank you.
So let's get started with the basics. Can you tell us what are data and AI ethics?
Yeah. And so this is slide one in the course. So this is the first lesson. But before I can really define data or AI ethics, it's probably worth just defining ethics. And to be clear, I'm no philosopher. So this is a very simple definition, but I'm sure if you asked someone in that field, it might get a little bit deeper. But basically, ethics are a set of moral principles that govern a person's or society's activity, right? So what are the moral principles behind, how we view things as right and wrong? And then when we go into data ethics, what we're really talking about is a system of moral principles centered around how data is collected, stored, and used. And then when we extend that to AI ethics, it's similar, right? So there's some overlap between data and AI ethics because AI is built off of data, but it's really just the moral implications and guidelines for the deployment and use of AI systems or artificial intelligence. And just to make that more concrete, that's very abstract. But if we think about our digital footprints, right, we are constantly generating data online. And think about your personal information from the perspective of data ethics, right? If I were to go into your wallet and take the information off of your driver's license without telling you, you would probably feel like there was a violation of some sort of ethical principle there. I didn't ask for permission. I just went in and grabbed it. You have no idea what I'm using that data for. It'd probably make you feel very uncomfortable. And the same thing might be true. Let's say I'm renting you a car online. There might be a very valid reason for me to collect your driver's license information, but you should have the right to give me that data to move forward with that transaction. The other piece is, okay, you've given me that so you can rent a car. I legally need your driver's license to rent you a car. But have I crossed the line if I then go and say, hey, it looks like Alice loves sports cars to a bunch of car dealerships in your area, and all of a sudden you're getting bombarded with, calls and emails about buying a sports car, right? So there's different layers to how we can use and collect data. And so we just kind of talk about the principles around how to collect data ethically, how to use people's data ethically, and how to secure people's data ethically. In other words, we kind of refer to this as ethical data stewardship, which is a major pillar of data ethics. And then moving on to AI and also just algorithmic ethics, right? There's a lot of ways that machine learning models and AI tools are used. And if we're not careful, though, like basically taking decision making that used to be made by humans and just assuming that a machine is going to make decisions ethically is a false assumption. I mean, to be very careful about how we're designing machine learning models and AI tools to make sure that the outputs of those models aren't causing harm. And we have to really build a frameworks around how to assess whether they're causing harm. And there's a few different ways that they can do that. And, we dive into that in the course. But the fundamental thing is really like, you know, the biggest goal of this course overall, and the biggest reason we have AI and data ethics is thinking through whether or not someone could be hurt or someone would be upset if we were using their data in a specific way, or if our data products like machine learning or AI models could cause someone harm.
That's so interesting because I had heard of data ethics before, but then AI ethics seems to be newer and it makes total sense given all the new technologies that have come up recently. Um, but I just feel like it's all moving so fast. Like the
Mm-hmm.
technology gets deployed and then everybody has to figure this out afterwards. And that sounds like it sounds like in this course you go through a lot of those examples.
Yeah, for sure. And so we use a lot of like real world case studies to kind of motivate these issues. And then we dive into kind of defining these sorts of principles. And then we kind of put it back to the student like, okay, now that we've learned a little bit more about this, we've seen a real world case that went wrong. Here's a new hypothetical. How might we think about this if this was happening to us in our workplace or even as a consumer, right?
So have you experienced any data ethics or AI ethics situations on the job?
Um, Yeah, so sort of. One of the things that we talk about in the course is the use of proxy variables, right? So a proxy variable is a piece of information that might be representative of another piece of information. And specifically, when we talk about this in the context of data ethics, what we're talking about is a proxy for demographics. So one of the most common and one of the most powerful variables you can often use in a lot of domains is something like geographic location. So if you were looking for, which neighborhoods would be the best to build a luxury shopping store in, right? You'd probably say which zip codes are the wealthiest, and you'd identify that. And on the job though, like in other jobs I've had, like we're looking for certain types of behavior, or maybe certain like where should our sales agents spend their time? And if you're not careful, you could end up creating a system that where like sales agents are avoiding certain neighborhoods and what that means is you're avoiding certain demographic groups, which in many cases could be considered immoral. And so you have to be very careful. Like, and we've had those discussions in early stages. We use zip code, which is very powerful for predicting sales, but then we realize like, hey, we're excluding entire communities. So we have to rethink how we're going to use certain variables, or maybe just discard the use of a useful variable, because what we're going to find is that we're really discriminating against communities or geographies that it might be underrepresented communities historically.
That sounds
So
really tricky. Like I feel like that's something that a lot of us would just do accidentally while you're looking through your data.
yeah, and that's the exact and like this didn't happen to me specifically. It happened to a colleague. But the good thing is that he had an ethical mindset and he had understanding of some of these issues. So he was able to identify this in a prototype phase, so before it was deployed. But the biggest reason we really released this course, and the reason why I think it's a must-take course for data professionals in general, is look, I'm not going to ever act perfectly ethically in my personal or professional life. I strive for that, right? But if you have an ethical mindset, you're much more likely to catch potential issues, particularly if your entire team has those, right? So everybody has ethical blind spots, or blind spots due to how they grew up. But if you have a team full of people who are coming at an ethical issue with different perspectives, like me in particular, like I love maps. So if you like, I love looking at like maps by, life expectancy or demography or whatever the case is. And like, I would probably spot that pretty easily, just knowing like how neighborhoods work. But like, if you don't have that specific knowledge, you might want to just think carefully about like, you have to take the extra step of validating a lot of these things. But if you don't have an ethical mindset, if you don't understand that what you're doing could potentially be discriminatory or harmful, you're never going to dig that layer deeper when you're building a data product. And that's how we end up with so many of these scandals related to AI, or, data theft, or et cetera. Like, there's been plenty of stories in the news about um, various like issues related to data products. And a lot of it's just because people aren't taking the time to pause and say, who might be harmed by this? We're just like excited to get the next new thing out. And that brings me to another point. She didn't ask, but one of the
But
things
I'm
that
happy to
we
hear.
one of the things that we do in this course is define the fact that like ethics and the law are fundamentally different things. So the law is often informed by ethics. So, we would say ethically, right? It's unethical for you to steal from somebody, or to, murder them, or whatever the case. And that's what leads to laws that make it illegal to do those things. But when it comes to technology, right? So many of the technologies that are being developed, we have no sense for like the types of harm that technologies can cause, whether that's, we think about the effects of industrialization. Overall, a net good, but things like pollution, like when they were building coal plants in the 1880s, they weren't thinking about the types of harm that could cause. And it's taken years for us to put regulations in place, kind of say, hey, yes, we still can have electricity, but we need to be very careful about like how, when, and where we build power plants to make sure that like the environment, or even people's health is protected. And so the reason why like an ethical framework is particularly important in tech and data is that we're often outpacing the law in terms of regulations. And we are starting to see more regulations come about, like the EU in particular with GDPR, has an AI Act. All of these things are following the development of technology, but typically there's a lot of gray area in tech specifically because laws haven't been developed. But I would make the case that if you're operating ethically, you'll avoid a case where you build a product a law comes into place and you have to rebuild your entire product because you were operating a gray area that's no longer gray. But if you kind of try to think through these ethical issues ahead of time, you might avoid having to rebuild your entire business because the government has put laws into place because there was harm caused by what you were doing.
Yeah, I feel like this course is so helpful for a lot of us in data roles because we're typically so focused on the technical piece. And this is just, I wouldn't even say it's an afterthought. It's just something you don't really think about. But when you're talking about this ethical mindset, it sounds like it's mostly awareness and then knowing about other examples out there to see if you're doing something similar to that. And yeah, that seems useful for a lot of data people.
Yeah, I mean, because a lot of times you're like excited to be like, oh, we have this
Yeah.
data, like let's use it. And it's like, well, like, do we think our customer would be happy if they found out we were using this or giving it to somebody else that they didn't know what we were doing with it? Like one of the other things we talk about too is like when it comes to consent, right? You might give me your data, and what I do is I give you a 20-page legal document in order to like consent to basically anything I ever want to do with your data. And most people just check the box. And we kind of define that as like a very subpar form of getting consent because like technically you might be legally covered, but ethically you're still like doing things to or with people's data that they would be upset about. And so to us, like it's very important to ask proactively for consent if you're doing something with someone's data that they might not expect you to, or you imagine they would be upset for. And oftentimes all that requires is us thinking like, how would I feel if my data was used this way? But a lot of times as data scientists and data professionals, we just get very excited about like, oh, wow, we have this data. It helps predict this. Let's go. And just taking that step to really think through that can help avoid a lot of these issues, or at least like you have those conversations and make sure you're avoiding some of the really egregious examples that we've heard about.
Yeah, I mean, as a consumer, I feel like I almost expect the tech companies to just take my information and I don't know what's happening, but it would be nice if everyone just thought through this. Like, I feel like everyone should be required to take an ethics class at some point. Because it's not part of standard curriculum, but I really feel like it should be.
No, yeah, and it differs by field too. So like if you've ever had to work with healthcare data, like I've worked in like health insurance analytics, and you have to take pretty significant training on like the rules and regulations about working with healthcare data because the governments have identified that that's extremely sensitive and private information. And so the standard to do that is pretty high already for a lot of data professionals. But then we have this whole other fields that are the complete Wild West. And it's like, if you think about social media, right?
Yeah.
I could learn so much about your life by looking at who you message, what you say, who you're friends with. And, on aggregate, like people probably don't care. But like if you did have a malicious actor, they could make your life difficult in some
Yeah.
cases. One of the questions you might ask is, would people use my product differently if they knew that I was like, for example, reading all of their messages? Or if I knew it could be
Yeah.
shared with someone that I cared about, like would I, make a snide comment about my mother-in-law if like I knew that it could get back to her, right? Like that's hypothetical example, but yeah, you get the point.
Yeah. Well, one other question for you coming back to the course is as you were developing the course and finding all these use cases or examples, was there anything that was surprising or
Um, I mean, the biggest was just like how many examples of case studies I could use.
oh no.
Yeah, I mean, most people have probably heard of things like Cambridge Analytica, the Facebook
Yeah.
scandal that may have impacted the 2016 election. There's so many. There's just so
That's
many
so
examples.
unfortunate
I
because I feel
know.
like when I started first getting into data ethics maybe 5 years ago, there weren't too many. It was starting to increase for sure, but yeah, I guess these days.
And I think too, it's sort of a long-tailed problem in some cases. I think one is that with more awareness, people are more likely to flag these things. So,
Yeah, that's true.
something that might have been going on while you were just learning about it, was reported on shortly after, or like it may have taken a few years for it to bubble up or whatever the case. But yeah,
But I guess that's a good thing because then laws will be put into place and then things will hopefully get more ethical.
yeah. And the other thing is that like a lot of times, in cases where laws have been passed, there's been lawsuits and those take years. And so do like legal cases. So in some cases, what was morally gray or was kind of flying under the radar has been, you know, either stopped or brought to light by a lot of the activity that's happened in the last 5 years too.
So then what do you think is going to be coming in the future, like in the next 5 years or 10 years?
I mean, I think it'll be very interesting to see, but I think AI regulation, specifically around tools like ChatGPT, Gemini, all of those LLMs. There's some really interesting open legal questions in the United States. In Europe, as I mentioned, passed the AI Act, which it's very tricky. But like one of the most fundamental questions about these tools is a lot of like LLMs like ChatGPT like scraped tons and tons of content off the web, right? So Wikipedia, Reddit, etc. So like if you're a Reddit user and you're writing posts all the time for free, you might be doing research to make your posts. You might be like helping contribute to humanity's knowledge. And you don't do that for like you don't get any benefit out of that necessarily. But like all of a sudden there's this company that's taken what you've generated, ingested it into their model, and they're profiting off of that. So you don't get credit. ChatGPT spits out an answer. You don't get compensated. But there's a for-profit entity that's taken your creative work. You sign the checkbox, so theoretically you consented, but like the same is true of image generation. So like artists have posted like their artwork on the internet. I want to share my work with others. But now image generation tools scrape those. They ingest artist styles. So whereas an artist may have gotten commissions before, now people can generate that art in the same person's style, not get any money. So these people are going to be getting less commissions to make art. These models have basically stolen all of their intellectual property. Well, I don't want to use the word stolen. It's not clear yet. Um, but whereas it used to be like, yeah, I'm happy to share my work on my website. Now it's becoming ingested into a product that could potentially compete with the artists themselves and like eliminate employment opportunities for them. Um,
That
and
sounds like
so,
a grim future unless something
so,
changes.
and there are lawsuits and they're working their way through the court right now to really determine these intellectual property issues. And then there are just broader conversations at the federal level in the United States, and as I mentioned, the EU, and I believe China is working on its own regulations. Um, on top of that, there's international bodies starting to form around like responsible AI use, because you can think about how these tools could be used for things like misinformation,
Yeah.
um, or just like creating toxicity in mass and social media, destabilizing countries potentially. Like there's a lot of big questions when it comes to like now we have no idea what's real on the internet because AI is so good. I can't tell it's writing apart from a human. And there's like big societal questions that are going to be at play, and the government is there's a lot of conversations happening at various levels of government.
I mean, it definitely seems like a hard problem, but it sounds like
Right,
there's just a lot more people aware of it, and then it's just going to evolve over the next few decades.
right. One of the really challenging like wrenches in this, it's like, okay, yes, we can regulate AI and make it, outline very specific use cases and say like how these models should be developed. But the risk there is that, let's say that like, and this is happening now, like the European Union has stringent AI regulations in place. The United States does not have a comprehensive regulation in place. And what's happening already is that like OpenAI is releasing more advanced models and new tools in the United States, but it will not do that in Europe. And so what regulators have to balance is this risk of innovation. Because if you're the only country in the world that is like ethically regulating AI, but all these other countries are allowing, more experimentation, let's say generously, you could find yourself falling further behind in the technological spectrum if you kind of freeze this with regulations. And so that's a very important consideration that regulators have to weigh is like, you know, if we want to eliminate all harm, right, we just make AI illegal. But there's somewhere in between Wild West and no AI that's probably going to be the balance, but finding that is very difficult.
I mean, it seems pretty overwhelming, like all the topics and conversation around AI. I would say to kind of wrap this up, do you have any like simple practical tips for people who are just dipping their toes in this? Because it's a really big problem. And
Yeah.
the thing is, I feel like there's so many good opportunities for discussion around this. Um, yeah, I'd love to discuss more. But yeah, for right now, is there like something simple that
Yeah.
listeners can try?
It's really easy to get, yeah, lost in these big, conceptual ethical issues. But if I had two pieces of advice, I would say do your best to cultivate an ethical mindset. Like, think about a few things, right? When you're working with other people's data, would you want your data to be used a specific way? Would you feel uncomfortable if it was used a specific way? Um, and like, are you getting consent to use that data, right? Like, because sometimes it's like, I wouldn't have minded if you asked me, but because you just did it, I feel very
Yeah.
uncomfortable. Um, and the other thing I would say is like, keep your eye on the news. Like, I mean, there's going to be a lot of regulations and conversations about these topics, but as much as you can, just try to stay informed and keep introducing yourself to new ethical dilemmas. Because to be fair, it's very hard to predict all of the ethical dilemmas that, using data in a specific way can cause. Like no one has that perfect foresight. But as we start to learn more and see areas where these tools and products are impacting us negatively, like make sure you're continuously learning and updating your, okay, maybe I shouldn't use data in that way. But I think it's important just to have that mindset, think critically before you dive into a project, and just make sure you're continuing to keep up to date both on regulations and any incidents related to data ethics.
Okay, that seems simple enough. All right. Well, thanks, Chris. That's all we're going to talk about today. But again, Chris's new course is called Data and AI Ethics, and you can check it out on the Maven Analytics platform or Udemy. It was great chatting with you, Chris, and thanks for your time.
See ya.
All right. Bye.